trademark half-smirk. A stack of cue cards fanned out in his hand like playing chips in a rigged game. Behind him, a screen lit up with a clip from a recent congressional hearing. The camera zoomed in on Jasmine Crockett, her voice forceful, her gestures tight and deliberate, as she grilled a cabinet secretary on federal housing failures. Her tone rose, not in chaos, but in command. She cited policy. She referenced statutes. She built her argument like a wall of steel. But just as her voice sharpened in frustration, the clip abruptly cut. The screen froze on her mid-sentence, eyes blazing. John leaned forward, tapped his pen, and delivered the line. "Is she a licensed attorney or a Bluetooth speaker stuck on full blast?" The audience burst into laughter. The kind that doesn't ask questions, the kind that drowns out nuance. John shrugged with mock confusion and doubled down. "Honestly, if shouting were a legal degree, I think she'd be teaching at Harvard by now." Another wave of laughter. But beneath the punchline was a message far less funny, a dismissal of her intellect, a trivialization of her years in law school, and her lived experience in courtrooms reduced to a volume joke. Her policy substance was ignored, her legal logic discarded. All that remained was a woman speaking firmly, and therefore supposedly ridiculous. The crowd clapped. No one asked if a male colleague delivering the same arguments with equal force would have been mocked the same way. The clip hit social media like shrapnel. On TikTok, it became a meme. On Twitter, it became a war zone. The replies came in floods. Loudmouth with a law degree. Another angry black woman playing lawyer. This is why no one takes them seriously. And beneath those, the more insidious attacks, memes comparing her to reality show characters, comments asking if her degree came from woke university. For every voice defending her, lawyers citing her credentials, journalists noting the dishonesty in the edit. There were 10 more trying to drown them out. But what stung more than the mockery was how routine it felt. Jasmine had spent years clawing her way through law school, arguing in courtrooms, drafting real policy, and yet all it took was one man, one joke, one camera to erase it all in the minds of millions. She wasn't angry, not in the way they expected. It wasn't the heat of indignation burning inside her, but something colder, something forged. A courtroom calm, a fighter's stillness before the first bell. The silence in Jasmine Crockett's office was razor thin. The glow from her muted television flickered across her desk, freezing on John Stewart's smirking face. Outside the window, the Capitol loomed beneath a gray sky, solid as ever. But inside, something was shifting. Her assistant Malik hovered by the doorway, clutching his phone like it might explode. "It's bad," he said. "It's everywhere, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook. They're ripping you apart." Jasmine didn't answer. She kept her gaze on the screen, not blinking. It wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated. It wasn't the first time a man in a suit tried to boil her years of work down to volume and theatrics. But something about this felt different. It wasn't just mockery. It was an attempt at erasure. And that she would not let pass. She reached for her phone, her movements slow, deliberate. No frantic texting, no calls to PR. She opened X. Her thumbs hovered over the keyboard, then began to move. Not typing, carving. Every word was selected like a legal argument presented before a hostile judge. "John Stewart, you think I'm not qualified to debate? Let's do it live. I'll bring my law degree. You bring your questions." She read it once, then again, and hit send. Not with emotion, but with certainty. The way a surgeon makes the first incision. Within 60 seconds, the air changed. Notifications poured in like a dam collapsing. Her name trended globally within 5. Thousands of users, academics, attorneys, students, even former adversaries, jumped in. Some in awe, some still attacking. But no one was ignoring her anymore. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline, her office line rang with a private number. It was CNN. No buffer, no small talk, just a direct proposition. "We want you and John. Prime time, one table, no scripts. Do you accept?" Malik held his breath beside her. Jasmine didn't blink. She stood, walked slowly to the window, and looked out across the city. The same one that once doubted her, denied her, demanded her to shrink. Then she turned, her voice low but lethal. Tell them yes. I'm used to being questioned. But this time, I won't be the one answering. And with that, the challenge wasn't just public. It was personal. From the moment she said yes, the countdown wasn't to a conversation. It was to detonation. Not of tempers, but of perception. Tonight, under the lights, the mask of satire would meet the weight of lived truth. The studio was packed wall to wall, not with laughter, but tension. Every seat was filled, every light precisely arranged to bathe the stage in a clinical glare that made every blink, every shift, every misstep impossible to miss. Behind the glass of the control room, producers murmured final instructions, but on the studio floor, there was only one sound: breath. The table was sleek, sterile, and wide enough to suggest diplomacy, yet narrow enough to promise confrontation. At one end sat Jon Stewart, casual yet confident, flipping a pen between his fingers like a schoolboy preparing for detention. He believed he could charm his way through. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat motionless. No smirk, no small talk, just a stillness so controlled it was unsettling. Not the silence of fear, but of precision, the type of stillness that precedes a cross-examination. As the broadcast began, Anderson Cooper offered a neutral welcome, setting the stakes in clinical terms. Then, like clockwork, Jon turned, microphone angled, and fired his first jab. Congresswoman Crockett, appreciate you being here. Hopefully we won't need a political translator tonight. Laughter scattered across the room, not loud but eager. The crowd still believed this was Jon's arena, that the rules would bend the way they always had, toward the punchline. But Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't shift. She didn't even blink. Instead, with the measured calm of a trial attorney preparing to dismantle a hostile witness, she reached for the black folder beside her. No theatrics, no urgency, just intent. She placed the folder on the table, unzipped it, and one by one, laid out the items. First, a certified law degree from Southern University Law Center, embossed and sealed. Then, an official transcript, GPA, 4.0, marked with the university's raised emblem. Next, a letter of commendation confirming her graduation in the top 5 of her class. And finally, her bar admission certificate, signed, notarized, and active. She aligned them neatly on the glass tabletop, not as props, but as evidence. Only then did she look at Jon. Her voice was quiet but unshakable, cutting through the air with no need to rise. I didn't come here to perform, Mr. Stewart. I came to correct the record, and I suggest we begin with yours. There was no laughter now, just silence. Thick, taut, like the space between the hammer's rise and the gavel's fall. For the first time, the studio audience, and Jon Stewart himself, understood this wasn't comedy. This was crossfire. And Jasmine Crockett had just claimed the floor. Jon had landed his line like a professional showman, expecting applause and dominance to follow. But Jasmine didn't react, not out of restraint, but because she had come prepared for this very moment. And unlike him, she didn't need jokes. She had documentation. Jon Stewart leaned forward, lacing his fingers, and delivered the line with calculated mockery. His voice dipped in faux concern. I mean, sure, a law degree looks nice on a resume. But these days, anyone with a printer and a pulse can hang one on their wall. The real question is, do you understand the law, or just know how to shout it louder than anyone else? The laughter came, but it was thinner now, not the confident howl of dominance, but the uneasy chuckle of an audience unsure if it had just crossed into something colder. The camera caught Jon's smirk lingering in the corner of his mouth as he glanced sideways at Jasmine. He thought he had her boxed in, young, black, female, and outspoken. But Jasmine Crockett didn't even blink. She didn't look rattled. She looked focused. With absolute composure, she reached into the matte black folder in front of her. A motion so slow, so deliberate, that it snapped the tension in the room taut. Her fingers moved like a surgeon preparing for incision. No hesitation, no flourish, just precision. The first document she laid on the glass table gleamed under the lights. A magna cum laude diploma from Southern University Law Center, the embossed seal catching a golden edge. Then came the official transcript, stamped, signed, and crystal clear. GPA 4.0, every line spotless. She didn't look at John. She was building a case. Next, a letter confirming full academic scholarship, awarded not by chance, but by competitive excellence. And finally, she produced a letter of recognition from the dean, verifying her place among the top 5 graduates of her class. Only then did she raise her eyes, not just to meet his, but to pin him where he sat. Her voice came low, calm, and implacable. I didn't bring papers. I brought proof. I don't just hold a degree. I earned every line of it. I didn't coast. I competed. And I didn't just pass law school. I stood at the top of it. The words didn't echo. They landed. And they changed the room. You could feel it in the way the audience shifted. The laughter died instantly, suffocated by the weight of truth. The air turned dense. No one clapped. No one moved. John, for the first time all evening, didn't speak. His face remained still, but his eyes betrayed something new. Recognition. He hadn't prepared for this. He came to mock a resume. What he got was a legal dossier that spoke louder than any quip he could muster. Jasmine hadn't just defended herself. She had flipped the courtroom. And for the first time in his career, John Stewart was no longer in control of the narrative. The papers on the table proved she belonged. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. Because belonging wasn't the same as being believed. Not in a room where credentials still had to shout to be heard. She didn't rush. She let the silence linger. Let it stretch and press down like the air before a coming storm. When she finally spoke again, her voice was low but charged, a current just beneath the surface. I didn't grow up thinking I'd wear a suit and argue policy in rooms like this, she said, eyes fixed not on John, but beyond him, as if addressing every person who had ever dismissed someone like her before hearing them speak. Law school wasn't my inheritance. It was a decision, one I made while working double shifts, carrying debt, and walking into classrooms where I was often the only black woman in the room. She didn't blink, but I stayed. I studied harder. I rose higher because I knew that one day I'd have to sit at a table like this and justify my existence. Her voice sharpened, but didn't rise. After graduation, I didn't take a job in some downtown tower defending the powerful. I became a public defender in Texas, not because it paid well, but because the people who needed the law most couldn't afford anyone else. The lights gleamed off the surface of the documents still resting before her, but now the attention wasn't on the paper. It was on the weight behind them. I represented mothers whose sons were beaten during traffic stops. I stood beside teenagers railroaded by plea deals they didn't understand. I argued in front of judges who called me young lady instead of counselor, until I made them say my name. She turned now fully to John, and her voice dropped half a note, deadly calm. I brought 3 police departments to court for excessive force, and I won. Not with volume, with law, not with privilege, with facts. A long breath passed before she delivered the final blow, each syllable as clear and deliberate as a closing argument. I didn't study law to write sketches. I studied it to defend people no one else showed up for. I don't speak loudly because I like the sound of my voice. I speak loudly because silence has never protected us. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. The audience, once so ready to laugh, now sat motionless, as if any sound might undo the gravity of what had just been spoken. John Stewart, for the first time that evening, didn't look clever. He looked unprepared. His smirk had vanished. His pen had stopped moving. And the studio, packed with lights and cameras and expectations, felt suddenly small. Far too small to contain what Jasmine Crockett had just made real. The weight of Jasmine's testimony still hung in the air like smoke after fire, and John felt it, the audience leaning away from his side of the table. So he did what many men in power do when cornered by truth. He rose above it, or tried to. John adjusted in his seat, forced a smile, and reached for neutrality, but the shift in his tone gave him away. "Congresswoman," he said with a carefully measured pause, "nobody's questioning your passion or your courtroom wins. But let's be real. This is national policy, federal legislation, geopolitical stakes. The question is, he gestured broadly, voice light, but his words razor-edged. Do you really believe that your experience in local courts, in your district, qualifies you to make decisions for 330 million people? He delivered the line like a parachute, a safe return to abstraction, to systems, to sanitized theory. But beneath the phrasing was something unmistakably familiar, the dismissal of proximity, the idea that pain only counts if it's processed from above, never from within. Jasmine didn't shift, didn't blink. Her reply came not from the throat, but from the bones, steady, controlled, and sharpened with exhaustion. John, she said, each syllable deliberate, you think my experience is too small because it wasn't televised, because it didn't come with briefings or pundit panels. Her eyes locked on his, her voice tightening like a noose. But I don't study broken systems. I live in them. I've watched a mother break down in a hallway after her eviction hearing. I've held the hand of a 16-year-old client who was arrested for resisting arrest, a charge that means nothing and everything at once. I've written policy between funerals, John. I've drafted amendments while watching entire neighborhoods disappear from maps drawn by men who've never set foot there. Then she leaned in slightly, not with aggression, but with gravity, like truth leaning on the table. You observe policy through satire. I endure it through survival. And no, I don't see it from a screen. I see it from the ground. The line didn't land. It detonated. A sharp inhale cut through the crowd, followed by the kind of silence that doesn't wait for a punchline. It waits for meaning. John leaned back, visibly rattled. Anderson Cooper, sensing the shift from debate to reckoning, cut in hastily. Let's bring the temperature down. But it was too late. The atmosphere had already changed. Jasmine hadn't just answered the question. She had exposed the framework that made the question possible in the first place. She had already dismantled the narrative he built, not with rage, but with unshakable truth. But in a world that often demands receipts from the unheard and lets the loudest rewrite history, Jasmine Crockett knew one final act remained. Not for revenge, but for balance. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she let the silence breathe, thick and charged like the pause between lightning and thunder. Her fingers moved with practiced calm as she reached once more into the black folder at her side. The same folder that had, piece by piece, unraveled the assumptions John had wrapped himself in. But this wasn't a transcript. It wasn't a diploma. What she pulled out now was a single page, faded slightly at the edges but crisp where it mattered. A photocopy of an email, printed, dated, and signed. She placed it on the table like a chess master laying her final piece. Then she looked at John. Not smug, not superior, just surgical. This, she said, her voice cool and deliberate, is an email you wrote as an undergraduate. Political Science 101, College of William and Mary, dated March 2nd, 1984. Her eyes didn't leave his. You sent it to your professor asking, no, begging, not to fail. The word hung in the air, stark and deliberate. A collective shift rippled through the audience. Backs straightened, eyebrows lifted, jaws tightened. Something seismic had moved under the surface of the studio. The energy no longer flowed toward John Stewart. It recoiled. John's smile faltered. His eyes flicked to the paper, like it might vanish under pressure. Jasmine leaned in, giving no space for evasion. You wrote, and I quote, Professor Wilkins, I really need at least a C. If there's any way I can earn some extra credit, resubmit an essay, anything, I'm begging here. She read it slowly, letting every syllable sink in like lead. You signed it. Jonathan Stewart Leibowitz. The studio lights suddenly felt harsh. Cameras adjusted, zooming slightly to catch John's reaction. His hands had stilled. The pen he'd been idly twirling all night rested forgotten beside his notes. The air was tight, not from heat, but humiliation. You questioned my academic integrity, Jasmine continued, voice low but relentless. You mocked my legal training. You turned my courtroom experience into a punchline. Her tone never wavered. But here's the truth. I never had to beg a professor to let me slide. I didn't plead for leniency when my future hung in the balance. I earned my spot in the courtroom, in Congress, and at this table. She gestured once, briefly, to the letter between them. You tried to reduce me to a stereotype. But what you revealed was your own fear. Fear of someone who didn't have to ask for approval to belong here. The audience was silent, held in a moment so taut it could have snapped under less disciplined hands. Jasmine's did not shake. Her words didn't tremble. She was not grandstanding. She was testifying. This isn't about a C, she added after a pause, gaze sharpening. It's about the way you use your platform. You present yourself as the conscience of the public, the person who calls out corruption, who keeps the powerful in check. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in clarity. But when a black woman walks in with receipts, you deflect. You joke. You question her legitimacy, not because she's wrong, but because she refuses to apologize for being right. John blinked but said nothing. His face had drained of its signature performance energy. He looked human now, not the satirist behind a desk, but the student caught red-handed with a plea that contradicted his persona. And what's worse, Jasmine said, her voice nearly a whisper now, is that if I hadn't brought this, if I hadn't printed it, preserved it, proven it, no one would believe me. Because that's how the system works, isn't it? Her words cut deeper now, turning the moment outward into the world watching. You don't have to prove your past to be taken seriously. I have to document mine just to be allowed in the conversation. A sharp breath could be heard across the room. Someone gasping involuntarily, like a truth too big to swallow had finally landed. Jasmine sat back in her chair slowly, not victorious, but resolved. She had not come to destroy John Stewart. She had come to reveal the imbalance he'd tried to laugh over. And now the paper between them did more than expose his past. It reframed the entire debate. This wasn't a clash of wit versus inexperience. It was a confrontation between cultural insulation and lived consequence. John lowered his gaze. There was no comeback clever enough, no detour charming enough. He glanced at Anderson Cooper, who sat motionless, stunned. And in the silence that followed, a silence louder than applause, the truth stood taller than either of them. Jasmine Crockett had walked into a room built to humiliate her and made it impossible to ignore the weight of what she carried in. No shouting, no spectacle, just truth, documented, printed, and finally, undeniable. John had gone quiet, and for the first time, the silence didn't belong to the audience. It belonged to him. But Jasmine Crockett didn't stand in that silence for vindication. She stood in it for truth, and truth wasn't finished speaking. She let the stillness sit. It wasn't a pause for effect, or a dramatic beat before the next blow. It was reverence for every woman who'd ever had her voice edited out of the room, her facts misquoted, her tone mistaken for threat. Jasmine sat upright, composed, hands resting gently on the table. The open letter still between them like a mirror John couldn't look into. And then her voice returned, not louder, just deeper, more surgical. There was a time when I respected you, she said, each word placed like a step on courtroom marble. Not because you were funny, because you were brave. You questioned the powerful, not to make them look foolish, but to make them accountable. You used laughter as a flashlight. She turned her eyes toward him now, not in contempt, but clarity. But somewhere along the way, that flashlight turned into a spotlight. And instead of shining it at the systems, you started shining it at the people already fighting them. John blinked. He shifted slightly, as if something in her voice made him feel the weight of the chair he sat in. A chair once meant for critics of power, not gatekeepers of it. You used to lift the curtain, she continued, but now you've become the velvet that hides the stage. Her tone remained calm, not mocking, almost mournful. You disguise it with punchlines, with irony, with just enough plausible deniability that you get to walk away from every wound you leave with clean hands. She looked down briefly, not to retreat, but to gather a thought so dense it needed silence. When she looked back up, the fire returned. You mocked my voice, my presence, my credibility. Not because I was wrong, but because I made you uncomfortable. Because I refused to enter this room on your terms." She took a breath, just one, and then turned from him, fully, finally, and locked eyes with the camera. The room shifted. The audience felt it, like a building about to change shape. Jasmine Crockett wasn't speaking to John anymore. She was speaking to the country. "I'm not here to amuse you," she said, voice quiet but ringing like iron. "I'm not here to play the role you wrote in a monologue I didn't agree to. I didn't come to be decoded, softened, or trimmed down to fit the format." Her gaze was steady, her jaw still. "I'm not asking to be heard through the filter of comedy. I am demanding to be understood through the clarity of truth." And then she leaned in slightly, not toward the table, but into the lens, into the millions watching who knew exactly what she meant. "I don't need your translation. I don't need your tone correction. I don't need your laugh track. I need and deserve to be recognized as I am, unfiltered, uninvited, and undeniable." The line cracked the atmosphere open. It wasn't rage. It wasn't drama. It was reclamation. The moment when a woman who had been spoken over, spoken for, and spoken around stood still and made the world turn toward her. The studio didn't respond immediately. That's how truth works. It doesn't demand applause. It halts it. It rearranges the air. And in that rearrangement, a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another, and another. It wasn't the raucous cheer of comedy. It wasn't catharsis. It was consent, agreement. A room of people finally are hearing not what they expected, but what they needed. John sat motionless, lips parted slightly, as if a comeback had formed, and then died before it reached his mouth. He glanced toward the moderator, but Anderson Cooper said nothing. Even he knew this wasn't his moment. Jasmine had changed the terrain, not by overpowering John, but by outlasting every assumption that had been made about her before she opened her mouth. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't slung insults. She hadn't cracked a single joke. And yet, it was her who rewrote the rules of the room. The applause had faded into something more powerful, reverence. Not for the spectacle, but for the woman who had just redefined it. And as the air began to settle, Anderson Cooper leaned slightly forward, sensing the weight of the moment wasn't over, but asking for one final truth. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't cut the tension. He simply opened a space. "Jasmine," he said, his tone softer than it had been all evening, "if you could say one thing, just one, to the young people watching tonight, especially those who feel underestimated, misunderstood, what would you tell them?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. She turned her head slowly, eyes drifting upward, not searching for the words, but searching for the weight they would need to carry. Her posture was no longer defensive, no longer bracing for impact. She sat with a quiet certainty, like someone who had already walked through fire and learned to breathe inside it. When she looked back toward Anderson, her face was calm, but her eyes burned. "I would tell them this," she said, voice low but clear, each word measured like a closing statement before a silent jury. "No one will hand you your worth. No one will come along and announce that you matter. No system, no institution, no talk show host is going to stamp you with approval." She turned slightly toward the audience, then back to the camera, drawing her message closer to those beyond the studio. "You have to carve it out, every inch of it. You have to claim space in rooms that weren't built for your voice. You have to speak when they tell you to stay quiet and stand firm when the ground shifts beneath you." Her hand rested lightly on the table, next to the folder now closed but never forgotten. "They'll question your degree," she continued. "They'll question your tone, your background, your right to even be there. They'll try to bury you in doubt and then blame you for not blooming." Her voice sharpened, not in anger, in conviction. "But you don't owe them politeness for surviving what they've never lived through. You don't owe them permission to fight for your future." She leaned in now, not toward Anderson, but the camera again. It wasn't performance. It was direct address. A transmission to every kid with a borrowed laptop and a question they've never dared ask aloud. When they question your qualifications, remember, the real proof isn't on paper. It's in what you're willing to face when they hope you'll walk away. A stillness fell over the room. No music swelled, no prompter rolled. It was just her voice, sharp, clear, and echoing across an audience far bigger than the studio could hold. "They'll tell you to wait your turn," she added, her tone now a slow crescendo. "They'll say you're not ready, that your life is too messy, your anger too loud, your dreams too big. But I promise you, and no one who ever changed anything was invited to do so." Her gaze deepened. "You show up anyway. You make them uncomfortable. You remind them that history didn't move forward because someone got a polite email. It moved because someone refused to be erased." John didn't speak. Not anymore. He had become what he once warned against. A host out of his depth when real people refused to play characters. Jasmine sat up straighter now, not taller, just more visible. To the girl in the back of the classroom who doesn't raise her hand because she's been laughed at once before, to the boy who reads under streetlights because the electricity got cut again, to the kid who's told they're too this, too that, too angry, too black, too queer, too different to lead. "I see you." Her voice didn't shake. It rose. "You don't need their spotlight. You are the fire. You don't need their stage. Your life is the evidence." The audience had stopped blinking. Some were holding their breath. Anderson's hand twitched slightly, like he was reaching for something to ground himself with. But Jasmine hadn't finished. She gave one final glance at John. Not cruel, not smug, just finished. Then she turned completely to the camera. "This world will try to make you a footnote in a story you were born to headline. But you don't owe it humility for surviving it. You owe it only this: the courage to live out loud, to rise when they bet against you, and to speak the kind of truth that doesn't need applause to echo." And in the deafening quiet that followed, someone in the back began to stand, then another, and another. No cheering, no chanting, just a standing silence. The kind that doesn't demand noise to be felt. Jasmine Crockett had done what few ever manage on live television. She didn't win the moment. She transformed it. She turned a setup into a summit, a trap into a pulpit, and with nothing but truth and memory as her tools, she carved a new space. Not just for herself, but for everyone watching who thought they'd never be seen. And as the cameras kept rolling, as the lights stayed hot, and the world kept turning outside the studio, one truth became inescapable. Recognition isn't given. It's seized. The crowd stood in silence, not because they were stunned, but because they just witnessed a woman rise beyond every attempt to shrink her. Jasmine had said all she needed. The truth now hung in the air like judgment, and for John Stewart, there was nothing left to joke about. John sat motionless, his posture slightly collapsed. Not defeated in the theatrical sense, but humbled in the rarest way. His eyes dropped to the table, not in shame, but in realization. The smile, the signature, half-cocked, camera-ready smirk that had disarmed presidents and CEOs was gone. In its place was the expression of a man who had just learned something about himself in front of millions. The kind of learning that doesn't feel like revelation. It feels like exposure. The camera didn't need to zoom in. The audience could feel it. Jon Stewart was no longer the moderator of the moment. He was its subject. Anderson Cooper, seasoned and sharp, recognized the transformation immediately. He cleared his throat gently, a low signal to the studio team that the dialogue, or at least the visible part of it, was coming to a close. "We'd like to thank both of our guests tonight," he began, his voice respectful, almost subdued. "Not just for their time, but for their candor. In moments like these, words matter. And tonight we heard more than words. We saw truth." He paused. "Unfiltered." He didn't look at John. He looked at Jasmine, and with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledged what she had just done, not as a performance, but as a reckoning. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't smile. She didn't try to extend the moment or underline the point. She reached calmly for the black leather folder, the same one that had dismantled layers of doubt, bias, and mockery. Her hands moved with poise, the way they might after presenting final evidence in court. She closed the folder with a quiet snap, clipped it shut, and slid it into her bag. The gesture wasn't rushed. It wasn't triumphant, it was final. Then she stood. The entire room, from the production staff behind the cameras to the front row of guests, watched her with the kind of attention normally reserved for standing ovations. But Jasmine didn't bask in it. She rose the same way she had spoken, with control, with gravity, and with absolute refusal to shrink. And then she spoke, just once more. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried with the weight of a closing verdict, echoing deeper than the volume could measure. Today was never a test, she said. This wasn't my exam. It was a regrading of truth, and I wasn't the one being scored. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't need validation from the very system she had just unraveled. She turned, her heels silent against the studio floor, and walked off the set as if she were leaving a courtroom, one where justice had finally tilted in the right direction. John remained seated, still quiet. The monitor above flickered briefly with the network's logo, but the room didn't move. No music played. Even the staff didn't reset. They simply watched her exit, not as a politician, not as a guest, but as a force. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was earned. The kind of silence that follows not a performance, but a moment where history changed shape just slightly, because someone refused to fold into the script written for them. Behind the glass, the control room didn't bark cues. The lead producer just whispered, "She flipped the whole damn show." Back in the studio, Anderson slowly stood. John still hadn't moved. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he understood, finally, that what had just unfolded wasn't a debate. It was an audit, and the receipts had been damning. The audience remained standing, not clapping, just standing, as if somehow they knew that sitting down too quickly would be disrespectful. In a media landscape obsessed with viral zingers and 5-second takedowns, Jasmine Crockett had done something no meme could capture. She held the room with truth, outlasted the bias, and walked out with the one thing no opponent could ever fake: dignity intact. No final word, no closing jab, just the echo of her truth hanging in the rafters. And on the studio floor, under the weight of silence, Jon Stewart, the man who once made empires squirm, sat still, facing the quiet reckoning he never saw coming. As Jasmine Crockett stepped off the stage and into the corridor, the moment didn't end. It detonated. What she left behind wasn't just a silence in the studio. It was a shock wave across the country, and within hours, that ripple became a movement. 12 hours later, social media wasn't just reacting, it was erupting. The phrase "Crockett exposed Stewart" wasn't just trending, it was dominating. The term surged to over 2 million mentions before dawn had even touched the East Coast. It wasn't driven by clickbait or PR firms. It was driven by pure, unfiltered resonance. People weren't quoting her because it was clever. They were quoting her because it was true. One clip, just 10 seconds long, of Jasmine looking Jon Stewart in the eye and saying, "You used to unmask power. Now you hide behind comedy," had been sliced, captioned, remixed, and reposted more times than even the producers of The Daily Show could track. It was no longer a soundbite. It was a statement of reckoning. Memes exploded like digital wildfire. Some framed Jasmine standing in the studio with a light shining behind her, the quote emblazoned like a prophecy. Others layered her calm, steady stare over stills of John looking down at the table, accompanied by captions like, "Class dismissed," or "Not your punchline today." T-shirts, mugs, and laptop decals flooded Etsy and Redbubble within hours. One shirt simply read, "This wasn't my exam, and I wasn't the one being graded." It sold out in 6 hours. But it wasn't just about merchandise or virality. Something deeper had been triggered, especially among those who had long felt talked about, but never to. Young Black students, first-generation college graduates, women in politics, public defenders, formerly ignored voices in underfunded communities. They saw themselves not just in Jasmine's credentials, but in her composure. She hadn't just defended her degree, she had reclaimed the right to define what intelligence, power, and presence could look like. One tweet that went viral read, "Jasmine Crockett just gave a TED Talk inside a roast battle and walked away untouched." Another simply said, "That wasn't a TV segment. That was a constitutional reset." News networks scrambled to keep up. CNN replayed the segment 3 times over the next day, each time pairing it with pundits trying to unpack what had just happened. Fox News attempted to spin it as a scripted setup, but even their own commentators struggled to discredit the rawness of the exchange. MSNBC aired a full hour titled The Crockett Doctrine, with anchors analyzing the rhetorical shift from defense to domination, from surviving the setup to flipping the stage. But the truest legacy wasn't in headlines or panel discussions. It was in the comment sections, the live streams, the stitched TikToks of teachers showing the clip to high school seniors. It was in the message boards where law students shared how often they'd been underestimated and how finally someone had stood up not with volume, but with verification. And then there was the phrase, the one line that cut deeper than any joke ever aired on Jon Stewart's show. "You used to unmask the powerful. Now you hide behind comedy." It was already being quoted in college essays. It was printed on posters hanging in break rooms of public defender offices. Protest signs appeared overnight, not just at marches for justice, but outside universities hosting political town halls, held up by students who had been told their tone made them too aggressive or their background made them unqualified. But what made the moment historic wasn't just Jasmine's poise or her preparation. It was that she never asked for the moment. She met it. She had walked into a space built for satire and turned it into testimony. She hadn't shouted down Jon Stewart. She had outclassed him, not in volume, but in values. An op-ed in The Atlantic read, "Jasmine Crockett walked into a studio meant to entertain and left it forever changed." Her words were not sound bites. They were tectonic shifts. And perhaps that was the most powerful part. She didn't stick around to revel in the applause. She didn't tweet a victory lap. She left wordless because she knew the words had already been immortalized. By nightfall, a new campaign had emerged. Teachers were asking to have Jasmine speak at commencements. Youth organizations requested transcripts of her segment for leadership seminars. Civil rights groups reached out, not just to praise her, but to partner. And in the background, the phrase that had gone viral took on a second life, not just as a quote, but as a mirror. Because when a country hears a line that stings that hard, not from a joke, but from a truth, it doesn't just retweet, it reflects. And for once, the laughter had stopped long enough to listen. In the aftermath of the broadcast, as screens everywhere replayed Jasmine's dismantling of pretense and power, the ripple of her truth didn't stop with applause. It reached the towers of academia, where polished tradition had long kept certain voices outside the door. For years, the Ivy League had treated her like a footnote, a name too raw, a presence too loud, a truth too close to the bone. She'd sent feelers before, outreach to lecture halls that hosted senators with records but no relevance, CEOs with scandals but still considered thought leaders. The responses had always been the same: polite deflection, radio silence, or vague commitments to future opportunities. To them, Jasmine Crockett was a politician too rooted in activism, a voice shaped by courtroom ceilings instead of legacy institutions. They didn't reject her credentials. They simply ignored them. And that was worse, because silence doesn't sting immediately. It corrodes, quietly, over time. But in the 72 hours following her appearance opposite Jon Stewart, something shifted. The first email came from a mid-level coordinator at Yale, an invitation to keynote a leadership symposium. Jasmine didn't react right away. She forwarded it to her chief of staff with 3 words: "Wait for it." And she was right. Over the next 3 days, they came in waves. Harvard's Kennedy School wanted her for a televised fireside chat. Princeton's School of Public Affairs pitched a week-long residency. Columbia asked if she would consider anchoring a speaker series titled Voices That Disrupt. Irony never traveled so fast. Each message tried to frame itself as opportunity, when it was really an olive branch with regret tucked inside. We believe your story exemplifies the intersection of integrity and impact. We now recognize the vital importance of perspectives that challenge established norms. You represent the kind of bold clarity our students desperately need. The flattery wasn't subtle, but it wasn't sincere either. It was the sound of gates opening, not because the guards believed in who was knocking, but because the crowd behind her had grown too loud to ignore. Jasmine read each line with the precision of a lawyer, not because she needed their praise, but because she wanted to remember exactly how quickly institutions can turn when public perception pivots. She wasn't bitter. She was focused. These were the same halls that once said her tone lacked academic polish, that her courtroom language didn't translate well to refined discourse. Now they called it compelling rhetoric. They used to critique her passion as untempered. Now they labeled it unapologetically authentic. The hypocrisy wasn't surprising, but it was illuminating. She had spent years watching these schools elevate thinkers who'd never lived the policies they dissected. Panelists who spoke of poverty from ivory towers, whose hands never once filled out food stamp applications, who quoted case studies instead of court cases they actually fought. She'd walked into hearings knowing entire universities trained people to sound like they cared more than she cared, and now they wanted her, not because they'd changed their minds, but because the world had changed its lens. The meme that broke their silence was now plastered across dorm room walls and student union screens. You used to unmask the powerful. Now you hide behind comedy. That line, birthed in a televised moment of restraint and fire, had become a creed for every young person tired of being called too emotional, too aggressive, or not polished enough. Jasmine hadn't just taken on Jon Stewart. She had taken on the entire structure that decided who got to be credible. So when Harvard's letter ended with, "We would be honored to learn from your journey," Jasmine didn't respond with acceptance or dismissal. She sent one sentence back. "My journey hasn't changed. Only your willingness to see it has." No one was prepared for the viral screenshot that followed. When her reply surfaced on social media, unedited, unsweetened, it triggered a second wave of commentary. Students began flooding their own schools with petitions. Bring her here, not to honor her, but to be held accountable by her. Professors debated internally how they'd missed the mark so fully for so long, and quietly, in administration meetings shielded from headlines, boards of trustees discussed how to protect their reputation while catching up with the moment. Jasmine agreed to only one engagement, not at the school with the highest offer, but at the one that had once denied her outright, stating her voice may not align with our institutional tone. That school now had students staging walkouts, using her face on posters, their voices echoing her quotes down hallways once reserved for legacy. When she walked onto their campus, it wasn't to be applauded. It was to speak without apology. She entered the auditorium wearing the same navy blazer she wore in the Stewart broadcast, carrying nothing but a folder, a sharp mind, and a memory too long to be softened by sudden praise. She took the podium. No preamble, no performance, just presence. "I wasn't invited here before because I didn't fit the box you thought leadership came in," she began. "But here's the thing about boxes. We either break out of them or we get buried in them." The students stood before she even finished. She wasn't a guest anymore. She was a mirror, and the institutions that had once refused her reflection were now forced to see what they tried not to. Power doesn't always come dressed in legacy. Sometimes it walks in wearing its scars like armor. And when it speaks, the room listens. As applause faded into reflection and the spotlight dimmed on the broadcast stage, a new voice rose, not from a pundit, not from a headline, but from the very halls that once molded Jon Stewart himself. It was nearly midnight when the tweet appeared, quiet, understated, and razor-sharp in its truth. From an office lined with fading lecture posters and hardbound dissertations, a respected professor at William and Mary sat staring at his screen, the replay of the Stewart-Crockett debate still open on a second monitor. He had taught there for 32 years, communications, media ethics, rhetorical theory, courses that shaped not only Jon Stewart's comedic instincts, but his moral compass too. The professor's fingers hovered for a moment over the keyboard, uncertain if he should interfere, unsure if it was his place to comment on a former student now caught in public reckoning. But then he typed, slowly and with finality, "Tonight, the educator wasn't Jon. It was Jasmine. 11 words, no tags, no hashtags, no qualifiers. Just a verdict. Clean, cold, and undeniable. By dawn, the tweet had ignited. At first it trickled through academic Twitter. Then political journalists picked it up. And within hours it was featured on the New York Times Morning Roundup. Professor from Stewart's alma mater says he was schooled by Crockett. On Reddit threads, young debate students called it a scholarly mic drop. Podcasters quoted it before their intros even rolled. TikTok creators used it as the final caption over clips of Jasmine laying out her credentials, her courtroom victories, her quiet dismantling of the man once considered untouchable in political satire. But the tweet didn't just echo because it was clever. It echoed because it came from within, from the very academic institution that had once been part of Jon Stewart's pedestal. This wasn't an outsider critiquing a titan. It was one of the Titan's builders saying, "She taught what we didn't." Inside the university itself, the reverberations hit hard. Students in media ethics woke up to emails from classmates sharing the tweet. A campus group that had invited Jon years ago now issued a statement praising Jasmine's grace under pressure and moral clarity. One sophomore wrote in the student newspaper, "For once, the table turned not with shouting or scandal, but with calm evidence. Jon didn't lose. He was outclassed." The professor who had written the tweet declined all interview requests. He didn't want to explain the obvious, but he did respond once in a reply that also went viral. "Jon taught us how to challenge power. Jasmine reminded us that power doesn't always wear a suit." This one landed like a lightning bolt, not just because of the poetic weight, but because of the implicit confession that even those who shaped the next generation of thinkers had underestimated what leadership could look like when it didn't come wrapped in familiarity. And for Jasmine, it meant something. Not flattery, recognition. She didn't repost the tweet. She didn't comment. But in a closed staff meeting that afternoon, her aide said she read it aloud once, slowly, and then folded her hands on the table and said, "They taught him the theory. I brought the consequences." Because that's what the moment was. A reckoning not just for Jon Stewart, but for a whole architecture of approval. The kind of approval that told young women they were too passionate, that told Black professionals they were too direct, that invited diversity but punished deviation from tone. Jasmine had not just walked onto Jon's stage. She had rewritten the syllabus. And in doing so, she didn't just get the last word. She got the first word in a new conversation, one that even Jon's own professors couldn't ignore. In the storm of media headlines, trending hashtags, and sudden invitations, the truth beneath the spectacle emerged, a deeper lesson that outlived the applause and demanded something more lasting than recognition. Reflection. The studio lights had cooled, the viral reels had run their course, but something far quieter and far more powerful remained. It wasn't the triumph. It wasn't even the public reversal of power. It was the raw clarity of the human lesson Jasmine had exposed, one that could never fit into a 60-second highlight or be stitched into a meme. This wasn't about who won the night. It was about what the night revealed. That brilliance doesn't always speak with an accent of legacy. That dignity can enter a room dressed in scars, not suits. And that those most questioned often carry the deepest clarity. Not because they're smarter, but because they've had to be just to survive. Jasmine Crockett had walked into a televised ambush, knowing full well the unwritten rules. Be composed. Be clever. Don't get angry. Don't get too quiet either. Smile just enough to be palatable. Speak just enough to be heard, but not feared. And above all, never let them say you were emotional. But she broke every one of those silent demands and still stood tall. Because the lesson wasn't about comfort, it was about truth. Not truth in the abstract, but the kind of truth that bruises, that challenges the world not to applaud you, but to see you. She never asked for pity. She never once demanded respect. She demonstrated it, line by line, fact by fact, with the calm of a lawyer and the gaze of someone who had nothing left to prove. Just something left to remind. And for anyone paying attention, that reminder hit harder than any insult ever could. You don't have to come from power to speak with it. You just have to refuse to let it talk over you. It wasn't just Jon Stewart who was silenced that night. It was the myth that comedy, intellect, or fame could ever replace moral courage. Jon had once built his name punching up, mocking those in power who never thought they could be questioned. But now, seated across from someone who had lived under those policies, someone who had fought them in courtrooms where jokes didn't work and silence meant losing, he couldn't punch. He could only deflect. And Jasmine saw it. She didn't attack the man. She dismantled the illusion. She made it clear that satire isn't justice, it's commentary. And while commentary can call attention, only action earns trust. That was the lesson. The world often believes it can categorize people by degrees, by zip codes, by how articulate or how measured they sound. But Jasmine flipped that on its head. Her existence, not just her words, was proof that experience is a credential, that survival is an education, and that standing alone on a stage takes more strength than 10 panelists sitting in safety. The lesson was not just for Jon, it was for every viewer who ever laughed too quickly, every employer who doubted a resume because of the name on it, every teacher who overlooked the quiet student with loud thoughts, every voter who thought authentic had to sound like a soundbite. Jasmine's poise didn't make her powerful. Her restraint did. Her refusal to fight fire with flame, her decision to fight dismissal with documentation, and above all, her discipline, the knowledge that sometimes the best revenge isn't exposure, but excellence. It was a masterclass in self-possession, but deeper still, it was a warning to the system, to the stage, to those who've always believed that credentials only count when they come from the right people. Jasmine had stood in courtrooms with grieving mothers, with scared teenagers, with victims of police overreach whose names never made headlines. Her resume wasn't built in green rooms, it was written in trial minutes and midnight phone calls. And when she sat across from Jon Stewart, that weight was in her eyes. Not anger, not revenge, conviction. The human lesson then wasn't that Jasmine proved herself. It was that she never had to. She had already done the work. The real shame was that she had to present it again. Because the world so often demands women like her reapply for dignity on a daily basis. In a better world, her voice would not be doubted. In a just world, it would be heard the first time. But until that world exists, she made this one listen. Not with volume, but with validation. That is what people remembered, not the GPA, not the viral quotes, but the look on her face when she said, "I don't need to be granted space. I built it." The way she stacked each paper on that table, not as props, but as receipts. The way she spoke to Jon, not as a rival, but as a mirror. This is who I had to be. Who did you become? The way she never once asked for grace, but gave it anyway, by not breaking the moment into bitterness. And that grace, that's what made her unforgettable. In a time when clout often trumps character, Jasmine Crockett reminded the world that character is what remains when the cameras stop. That justice isn't loud, it's precise. That no matter how many degrees you collect or jokes you craft, if you cannot recognize courage when it sits across from you, you've learned nothing. And most of all, that those we dismiss are often the ones carrying the truth that could save us all, if we'd only shut up and listen. So the human lesson was this: you don't need permission to be worthy. You just need the will to keep standing when the world calls you a disruption, and the wisdom to know that's exactly what change sounds like. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a guest on a stage, she was the stage. After the dust had settled and the echoes of Jasmine's words still lingered in the minds of millions, one question refused to go away. Not for her, but for the rest of us. What now? This wasn't just a television moment. This was a reckoning broadcast in real time. A mirror held to a nation that too often ridicules what it doesn't understand and dismisses who it fears might change the rules. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself, she ignited something. In a world numbed by sound bites, she turned a segment into a stand. In a culture obsessed with quick takes, she offered substance so sharp it left scar tissue. And now, if that moment is to matter, it cannot stay trapped in applause. It must become action. Because for every Jasmine who makes it to that stage, there are thousands more whose brilliance is buried beneath bias, whose strength is silenced by systemic gatekeeping. The next time someone questions a woman's place in the room, remember this: the room was never theirs to begin with. We just stopped asking who built the door. So this is the call. If you're a student, speak louder, even when they say your voice is too much. If you're a professional, challenge the idea that credentials only count when they come from comfort. If you lead an institution, open it, not just to diversity in appearance, but in thought. Start inviting voices that shake foundations, not just polish them. Share platforms, reevaluate panels, question who gets to ask the questions. And when someone like Jasmine stands their ground, don't just cheer, follow. Because change isn't about one woman at a desk with papers in her hand. It's about everyone watching, deciding whether they'll keep clapping or finally stand with her. Courage is not contagious unless it's carried. So carry it. In meetings, in classrooms, in how you hire, how you teach, how you listen. This moment is not a climax, it's an opening chapter. But only if you let it be. Only if you understand that when a woman looks straight through a legend and says, "This time I'm asking the questions," she's not just rewriting the conversation, she's rewriting the country. The question is, will you answer her challenge or stay seated in the silence she already shattered? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a high-stakes congressional showdown seen by millions, Jasmine Crockett steps into the spotlight with a stack of documents and a mission to expose the truth: that Linda McMahon handed millions to allies, while real small businesses were left to die. Across from her sits McMahon, calm, powerful, and unprepared for what's coming. Within minutes, the atmosphere shifts as Crockett reveals shocking numbers, hidden connections, and a trail of favoritism buried beneath years of polished politics. Tension explodes, reputations hang by a thread, and silence grips the room. What hidden truth turned this hearing into a national reckoning over corruption, privilege, and the price of power? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The air inside the Rayburn House office building was razor-sharp with anticipation. Journalists filled every corner of the gallery, cameras poised like loaded weapons, their red lights blinking in silent readiness. In the center of the hearing room, the mahogany witness table gleamed beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, and at its edge sat Linda McMahon, shoulders back, jaw set, expression unmoved. She wore her legacy like armor. Former Chief Executive Officer of World Wrestling Entertainment, former administrator of the Small Business Administration, and a woman accustomed to controlling the narrative. Dressed in an immaculately tailored cream blazer, she exuded practiced confidence, nodding politely at committee members, her smile a calculated blend of politeness and superiority. She had weathered scandals before and survived political storms with minimal damage. To her, this was just another hearing, a procedural formality, a stage she believed she owned. But then the door swung open. In stepped Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't there to play the supporting role. No camera flash could outshine the storm in her stride, nor the fury burning beneath her composed expression. Clad in midnight blue, her eyes locked forward with surgical focus, carrying a slim leather folder that might as well have been a weapon. This wasn't just about policy, it was about justice. As she took her seat behind the elevated committee bench, the room shifted. The buzz dulled. Linda McMahon glanced up just briefly and caught the look in Jasmine Crockett's eyes. Cold calculation wrapped in moral fire. Crockett had not come to speak softly or seek civility. She had come to expose something rotten, something buried deep beneath polished press releases and inflated resumes. And no amount of corporate bravado could prepare McMahon for the reckoning walking toward her. One click of the microphone, one sentence away. And then it began. Not with fire, but with frost. Linda McMahon, seated upright behind the witness table, shifted ever so slightly in her chair as the committee chair yielded the floor to Representative Jasmine Crockett. The older woman adjusted her lapel, folded her hands with ceremony, and spoke as though reading from a script she had written herself. One where she played the seasoned architect of industry, and Crockett was merely an ambitious understudy. "Congresswoman," she began, her tone perfectly polished, carefully dipped in the civility, but forged in steel. "I appreciate your passion for these issues truly, but I do hope you understand that operating a small legal consultancy, even a successful one, is quite different from navigating the vast complexities of our national small business infrastructure." The words came slowly, deliberately, as though she wanted each syllable to carry weight. "When I ran World Wrestling Entertainment, I wasn't just managing clients. I was managing global strategy, job creation, international expansion, and innovation at scale. We weren't theorizing. We were executing." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. McMahon's voice remained soft, but every note carried a veiled slap. "You see, I have signed the front of paychecks, not just the back. I have sat at tables where real economic risks were weighed, not hypotheticals. That's not something you learn in law school. It's something you earn through decades in the trenches." She gave a short, restrained laugh, more air than sound, as if to signal to the committee that the point had been made, and that anything that followed from Crockett could only be interpreted as naive rebuttal. A few Republican representatives on the panel nodded, almost imperceptibly, a quiet signal of alignment. On the sidelines, cameras zoomed in, trying to catch a twitch of Crockett's lip, a flicker of discomfort, something, anything, to confirm McMahon's subtle dominance. But there was none. Only silence, thick and reverberating. And in that silence, something shifted. Not in the air, but in the moral weight of the room. Because what Linda McMahon didn't know, or perhaps refused to know, was that the woman sitting across from her had been discounted before. Not once, not twice, but hundreds of times. She had been spoken to in that same tone on court benches, in back rooms, in press conferences, by men in expensive suits and women with impressive resumes who saw only the surface. To them, Jasmine Crockett was just another young activist, another black woman with too much emotion and too little experience. But behind Crockett's steady breath was a mountain of lived knowledge. Behind her unread expression was the voice of every small business owner in her district who was told politely and systematically that they didn't qualify, that they didn't belong, that someone else was more appropriate. And now here in this room it was happening again, but this time not quietly. The injustice wasn't just in the words McMahon used, it was in the ease with which she dismissed a fellow public servant as unworthy of standing across from her. The implication that business expertise came only from corporate pedigree and not from the lived struggle of trying to keep neighborhood shops alive through broken systems and empty promises. It was the same old arrogance wearing a new face. But what McMahon failed to see was that she hadn't just insulted Crockett. She had ignited her, and the reckoning had only just begun. But McMahon's smile hadn't even finished forming before Crockett moved. Quietly, decisively, like someone who had been waiting for this exact moment her entire life. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She simply reached into the slim leather folder before her and withdrew a single sheet of paper, holding it between her fingers like a blade. "Let's deal in facts now," Crockett said, her tone even and controlled, but laced with something undeniable. Truth. She placed the paper gently on the table, face up, the seal of the Office of Inspector General clearly visible at the top. "This audit," she continued, "was conducted internally but never released to the public. My office obtained it through a Freedom of Information Act request. It reviews the small business grant program during your time as administrator, and it reveals something deeply troubling." She paused, letting the room absorb the gravity of her words. "According to this official review, nearly 43% of the grants distributed during your leadership went to companies that failed to meet your own eligibility requirements, companies that were too large, too rich, or too politically connected." The silence in the room thickened like smoke. Crockett's hands remained steady as she pulled out a second document. this one covered in yellow highlights and bold red annotations. She read aloud with clinical precision, naming companies that had received hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, in federal funding, despite employing far more than the 50-employee cap or earning well above the $5 million revenue threshold. Titanium Technologies, Nova Healthcare Solutions, Retech Manufacturing Group, she listed, eyes never leaving McMahon. One of them had 215 employees. Another had annual revenues of $28 million. None of them qualified. All of them received grants. She turned a page. And what do these companies have in common? Their executives donated to your political action committees. One served on your nonprofit's advisory board. Another was previously employed by your husband's entertainment company. This isn't coincidence, Mrs. McMahon. It's a pattern of doors opening quietly for those closest to you, while small, honest businesses in underserved communities were left behind. Crockett leaned back slightly, but her voice dropped. More personal now, more pointed. I represent business owners who work 18 hours a day just to keep their lights on. Mothers running beauty salons out of their kitchens. Veterans trying to reopen cafes that shut down during the pandemic. They followed the rules. They applied. And they were denied. But your friends? Your allies? They walked through a side door none of us even knew existed. Her final sentence fell like stone. This wasn't just bad management. It was betrayal of the people this program was supposed to serve. But McMahon wasn't finished, at least not in her own mind. The sting of Crockett's accusations had sliced deep, but the former administrator straightened her back, clasped her hands together, and leaned into the microphone with the steady voice of someone who had survived far worse storms, at least in her own estimation. Congresswoman, she began with practiced calm, I understand your concerns, but in any nationwide program of this scale, there are always circumstances that fall outside the standard mold. Exceptions are not evidence of wrongdoing. They are tools of adaptation. Some of these businesses may not have fit the technical criteria, yes, but they served sectors in economic crisis. They were anchors in distressed communities, job creators in rural zones, innovators in emerging technologies. Our discretion allowed us to be responsive, not rigid. These weren't handouts for the well-connected. They were strategic choices made in real time to keep the economy from collapsing. For a moment she paused, as if her answer were both irrefutable and benevolent, as if the weight of her justification could somehow smother the evidence Crockett had already laid bare. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She let the words settle like dust, and then cleared them from the air with one cold, decisive breath. Reaching into the binder before her, thick, tabbed, meticulously organized, she flipped to a section labeled Disparity Zones, Denial Rates. Her tone remained composed, but the edge in it had returned, honed now not by emotion, but by righteous precision. Let's examine this idea of exceptions, Mrs. McMahon, she said, holding up a chart filled with numbers in black and red. In Texas District 30, which I represent, 96% of qualified applicants were denied funding. These weren't companies seeking flexibility. These were nail salons, mom-and-pop hardware stores, minority-owned landscaping businesses, and community daycare centers, every one of them meeting the written criteria. But they were denied, not once, not twice, systematically. She turned another page, revealing side-by-side approval maps, one saturated in red for urban centers like hers, another awash in green for wealthier suburban zones. And yet, companies like Fairmont Synergy, a firm with over 160 employees and $17 million in annual revenue, received full grant funding in under 14 days. They weren't in a distressed sector. They weren't in a rural zone. But their chief executive officer donated to 3 political campaigns you were affiliated with. Her voice dropped slightly, slower, like the tightening of a vice. Another recipient, Kinvara Diagnostics, received $900,000 while operating in a profitable biotech corridor and employing more than 100 staff. Their lead legal counsel once served on your advisory board. Tell me, Mrs. McMahon, how exactly do those qualify as distressed? The tension in the room thickened like fog. Crockett took a breath, not to collect herself, but to allow the weight of the silence to settle. You say exceptions are tools, but tools in whose hands, used for whose benefit? Because from where I sit, they were used not to lift up the vulnerable, but to excuse the elevation of the connected. The result wasn't flexibility, it was disparity. She leaned forward now, her eyes narrowing slightly, not with rage, but with an unbearable clarity. You call this adaptation, but I call it what my community felt every time they walked into a shuttered storefront. Abandonment masked as strategy. And no polished press release will change that. And just when the illusion of exceptions seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse, Jasmine Crockett tore it down, piece by piece, name by name, dollar by dollar. She turned another tab in her binder, red labeled and thick with attached documentation. Her fingers moved slowly now, deliberately, like someone about to detonate something that could not be undone. "Let's stop the theoretical, Mrs. McMahon," she said, her voice low but caring. "Let's discuss titanium technologies." She lifted a grant award approval sheet from the pile and held it in the air, the ink still crisp beneath the white light of the overheads. This company received $1.2 million through the Premier Business Grant Program in 2019. The same program that you insisted had been managed fairly and within eligibility guidelines. She stepped back from her seat and walked to the center podium, eyes locked on McMahon. At the time of their application, Titanium Technologies had 215 employees. Not 49, not even 100, 215. And their revenue? Over $28 million. More than 5 times the legal limit set for grant eligibility. A long pause. Crockett let the silence stretch like a blade drawn across the room. But it wasn't the numbers that made the room shift. It was what came next. "The Chief Executive Officer of Titanium Technologies," she continued, "is Robert Williamson. That name may sound familiar to you, Mrs. McMahon, because Mr. Williamson was a maxed-out donor to not one, but 2 of your affiliated political committees during the 2018 cycle. Gasps didn't erupt, but they pulsed beneath the surface. He also served quietly, unlisted in public briefings, on the advisory board of your family's nonprofit, where he contributed strategic insight during your time at the Small Business Administration." Crockett placed the documents face up on the table, slid them toward the committee, then met McMahon's eyes with unwavering calm. "That's not discretion. That's not economic triage. That's political access turned into public dollars." The energy in the chamber constricted. McMahon's jaw tightened. Her hands, previously folded in calm control, began to shift slightly, one thumb pressing against the other in small, visible circles. And Crockett wasn't done. Not even close. She turned another page. "Nova Healthcare Solutions," she announced with the force of a prosecutor entering final evidence, awarded $800,000 in federal funds. At the time, 178 employees, gross revenue just under $19 million, both metrics far beyond the limit. But perhaps most relevant of all, their executive chairman was a former vice president at World Wrestling Entertainment. "Your company, during your leadership." The camera lenses in the room focused now not on the speaker, but the subject. "He later served as a strategic transition advisor to your office at the Small Business Administration. Not because he was qualified in federal policy, but because he was loyal." Crockett took a breath, not out of exhaustion, but calculation. "This is not an isolated slip," she said, her voice deepening. "This is a pattern of doors opening in silence, behind closed meetings, for men in suits who already had options. While first-generation shopkeepers in my district, who filed every form, met every rule, passed every inspection, were told there's just not enough funding left." Her voice turned sharp as flint. "But there was funding. It just never made it to them, because it was already spoken for." The silence following Crockett's last revelation was not empty. It was suffocating. You could hear the shifting of paper, the strained breaths of aides, the low mechanical whir of camera lenses zooming in. But McMahon had no more silence left to hide in. She leaned forward, her polished demeanor cracking not in volume, but in desperation. I can't speak to every individual case," she began, her voice unsteady but still clinging to the illusion of control. "There are nuances to each grant. There were teams, review panels, compliance officers, discretionary authorities. These decisions weren't made in a vacuum. We had to consider a wide range of criteria. It's never black and white. But the words, vague, procedural, evasive, hung in the air like smoke from a fire already out of control. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her restraint was more terrifying than anger. "Mrs. McMahon," she said, slow and deliberate, "if what you're describing is a system of checks and balances, then I'd like you to explain why that system kept checking in favor of your friends." She reached into her folder and pulled a packet of printouts, emails, internal memos, staff notes, all neatly collated. "March 18th, 2019, she said, flipping to the top page, holding it up with surgical precision. "An internal email chain between you and your former advisor, Thomas Kelly. Subject line, priority list. Your instruction, direct quote, these applications should be pushed forward. We need some fast wins with this group." She paused, letting that line bleed into the room. "Now let me be clear," she continued, voice lower, steadier. "Every single company on that list received funding within 30 days. Most of them exceeded employee or revenue limits. And not one came from a distressed area or qualified as minority-owned or woman-owned. But nearly all had one thing in common. They had financial or personal ties to you." The committee chamber shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Members who had been casually observing now leaned forward. Staffers began whispering behind raised hands. McMahon's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles pale against the wood. But Crockett didn't relent. She flipped the page again. "Titanium Technologies, Kinvara Diagnostics, Hartley Innovations." I could go on. These weren't decisions made in the dark by some faceless bureaucracy. These were choices, your choices. And every time you chose a company with access, a company in my district lost its shot. Her voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow louder than any shout. "This isn't administrative oversight. This is systemic betrayal." And as Crockett's final line settled into the charged stillness of the room, "This is systemic betrayal," a subtle but irreversible unraveling began behind the witness table. Linda McMahon sat motionless for half a second too long. Her face, once unreadable behind the perfected sheen of public service in corporate polish, began to betray what words no longer could shield. A slight tremor crept into her right hand as it hovered above the water glass, then retreated. She tried again, but this time the glass clinked lightly against the table's surface, the sound startling in the silence. Her fingers gripped it tightly, not to drink, but to anchor herself against the spinning gravity of the moment. The pages in front of her, once prepared as shields of defense, now looked like foreign language. The print swam. She blinked rapidly, then reached for the top page as if rereading it might change its meaning. It didn't. The damning email, the donor-linked approvals, the numbers she'd never expected to see recited in public, let alone sewn together into a narrative she couldn't control. A thin sheen of sweat had begun to rise just above her brow. Her once confident posture slackened by inches. Her shoulders rolled forward as if bracing against a weight no one could lift. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her gaze flicked toward the committee chair, then to her counsel seated behind her, then to the cameras, red lights glowing like sirens that wouldn't stop. But no one came to her rescue. No interjection, no technical objection, no redirect. Just the weight of her own decisions, now crashing inward from every angle. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't moved from her seat, and yet McMahon sat as if the ceiling itself had begun to descend upon her. In that moment, every ounce of privilege, every polished line of resume, every room she'd once commanded, all of it cracked under the sheer, suffocating pressure of being seen without filter or frame, and there was no script left to follow. And as McMahon sat there, visibly unraveling under the weight of her own evasions, Crockett seized the silence, not to gloat, but to deliver something far more lethal: documented truth. Her movement was deliberate, almost reverent, as she reached into the final section of her binder and drew out a single sheet of paper encased in a plastic sleeve, its contents printed in clear, professional font. She held it in both hands like a judge preparing to read a verdict. "Mrs. McMahon," she said, her voice steady and cold, You testified that all grant recipients were vetted thoroughly and that any deviations from eligibility criteria were handled through a rigorous review process. She paused, not for drama, but to give McMahon one last chance to brace. Would you care to explain this email? Crockett laid the document flat on the table in front of her. Dated March 18, 2019, sent from your official SBA email to your then senior advisor, Thomas Kelly. The subject line reads, Priority Grant List. Her voice sharpened as she continued. The body of the message is short, direct, and unmistakable. You wrote, these applications should be moved to the top of the pile. We need some fast wins with this group. She leaned forward slightly, never breaking eye contact. No reference to eligibility, no mention of audit protocols, just political urgency. And what's more damning, Mrs. McMahon, every single business listed in that email received grant approval. Every single one. Despite the fact that the majority did not meet the employee or revenue threshold defined in your own program. The tension in the room hardened into something almost physical. Crockett didn't blink. One of them, as previously noted, was Titanium Technologies, 215 employees, $28 million in revenue. Another, Kinvara Diagnostics, over 100 staff, $18.9 million in gross earnings. Not outliers, not exceptions, violations. Her voice, though calm, now cut like glass. And these weren't accidental oversights. These were handpicked, prioritized, directed. She tapped the document with 2 fingers. By you. She allowed a beat of silence. And while these businesses, flush with political capital, were pushed to the front of the line, community businesses in my district, barbershops, diners, daycare centers, were being told they were denied, that the money had run out, that they were too late. She straightened her shoulders. But they weren't too late, were they, Mrs. McMahon? They were just never on your list. And after Crockett's final blow, delivered not with malice but with the calm devastation of truth, the weight of the moment bore down on McMahon like a slow, merciless collapse. She didn't speak at first. She couldn't. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. Her eyes flicked down to the document in front of her. The email, damning in its clarity, undeniable in its origin, and then darted briefly to the committee, to the rows of unspeaking lawmakers now watching her not as a former administrator, but as the subject of something unraveling. Her chest rose in shallow breaths, each one shorter than the last. When she finally found her voice, it came strangled, a rasp instead of a rebuttal. I don't recall sending that email in the context it's being interpreted, she muttered, her words colliding with each other. There were many submissions, thousands. The decisions weren't mine alone, but her defenses had lost their scaffolding. The polished diction, the calm cadence, gone. Replaced now with the halting, hesitant rhythm of someone trying to steady themselves in a crumbling tower of their own construction. Crockett said nothing. She didn't need to. McMahon's hands trembled visibly as she reached once more for the water glass, but her grip faltered. The glass clinked against the table, echoing far too loudly in the silence. She withdrew her hand and instead clenched it into a fist, knuckles pressing against the wood as if bracing for something physical. Her gaze dropped again to the pile of printed evidence that now sat like rubble before her. Emails, audits, charts, lists she never expected to see so publicly dissected. Her lips parted as if to try again, but then her face shifted, eyes widening slightly, the tension in her jaw giving way. A single tear welled, hung for a moment in the corner of her eye, and then fell, silently, without resistance, down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Not right away. Another followed, slower, trailing through the powder on her face, cutting a line that even the cameras couldn't ignore. And then, softly, so softly it barely registered as speech, she admitted what everyone in the room already knew. There were mistakes. Her voice cracked on the second word. There were decisions made that, looking back, I should have questioned. She blinked hard, the tears now steady, and her hand rose shakily to her face. I trusted people. I relied on processes that failed. And yes, I should have seen it. Her voice faded into a whisper. I should have stopped it. At that moment, the hearing room no longer held a figure of corporate might or political power, but a woman exposed and undone by a truth she could no longer reshape. And as the final syllables of McMahon's shaky admission faded into the stillness, I should have stopped it. Representative Jasmine Crockett did what few in that room anticipated. She did not press further. She did not capitalize on the collapse, did not exploit the tears now trailing through the last remnants of Linda McMahon's authority. Instead, with a steady inhale, she closed the folder in front of her and shifted the weight of the moment from exposure to action. Her voice, when it returned, was no longer honed for interrogation, but for rebuilding. "Mrs. McMahon," she began, her tone calm yet unwavering, "what we've uncovered here today is not just a series of administrative failures. It is evidence of a system so vulnerable to influence, so blind to equity, that it functionally abandoned the very people it was created to serve." Her hands remained folded, but her posture rose. "And so, I will not leave this hearing today with just indignation. I will leave it with legislation." She reached into her case and withdrew a crisp document with a bold black header, the Small Business Equity Act. She laid it on the table in full view, not as a threat, but as a promise. "This bill," she said, "will mandate independent multi-reviewer panels for all federal grant decisions. No more single gatekeepers, no more shadow shortcuts. It will require public transparency dashboards, updated in real time, where any American can see who receives funding and why. It will guarantee that no less than 40% of grant allocations reach underserved districts, places like the one I represent, where people follow the rules but never see the returns." The room no longer buzzed with confrontation. It listened. It absorbed. Crockett's eyes never left McMahon's now fragile figure, but her voice spoke beyond her, to the nation, to the millions watching who had long felt invisible. "We do not need more powerful people bending rules for their peers. We need structures that protect those without access, those who don't have lobbyists or personal connections or priority emails." This legislation is not about vengeance. It is about justice. Not the courtroom kind, but the kind that reaches barbershops, food trucks, and community health centers. The kind that makes systems serve everyone, not just the chosen few. Then, and only then, did she turn directly back to McMahon. "I am asking you, not as a former executive, not as a partisan, but as someone who today witnessed what happens when truth is brought into the light, will you support these reforms?" The question didn't explode. It resonated. It was not a trap. It was an offering. McMahon's lips parted. Her hands, now folded tightly in her lap, trembled faintly. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with a voice no longer clothed in power, she answered softly, "I don't agree with everything, but I agree it's broken. Yes, I will support it." And in that moment, the hearing didn't erupt. It settled, like dust finally touching ground after a long, brutal collapse. Not with celebration, but with solemn clarity. The system had failed, but someone, finally, was trying to fix it. And as McMahon's fragile voice faded into silence, "Yes, I will support it." The hearing adjourned, but the storm had only just begun. What happened inside those chamber walls didn't stay contained. It broke free, unleashed by a single video clip that captured it all with surgical precision. Jasmine Crockett, standing tall, holding a government-stamped email aloft like a verdict, while across from her, Linda McMahon sat paralyzed, shoulders slumped, mascara streaked, the embodiment of collapse. That 43-second clip, posted first by a Hill staffer on X, formerly Twitter, ignited like dry tinder. Within 20 minutes, it had crossed 1 million views. Within the hour, it had appeared on homepages across the internet. The headline that rose to the top was short and brutal. "She brought the receipts, and heir to a billion-dollar empire had nothing to say." But others were no less cutting. "McMahon exposed for grant favoritism, breaks down under fire," read another. A reckoning at the SBA, Crockett turns the tables on power, became a trending topic across platforms. By late afternoon, news vans crowded the east entrance of the Capitol. Reporters scrambled for live shots, their voices hurried, urgent, as they recounted the most shocking moments. Crockett's forensic delivery of data, the unveiling of the March 18th email, McMahon's final tear-soaked admission. Cable networks cut into scheduled programming with special reports. CNN opened its 6 p.m. broadcast with the words, "We begin tonight with a political confrontation that is already being called historic." MSNBC called it a masterclass in accountability. Even conservative outlets, typically aligned with McMahon circles, struggled to spin the footage. The visual was too raw, too clear. A woman long considered untouchable, crumbling under the undeniable weight of documented truth. And it wasn't just the national media. Local news in cities across America led with Crockett's speech. In Dallas, a headline ran, "District 30 Representative Shocks Washington with SBA Takedown." In Detroit, minority-owned businesses were locked out. Now the country knows. What had begun as a routine oversight hearing had become something far greater, a flashpoint, a reckoning, a rare, unscripted collapse of power in real time. And in every corner of the digital world, from late-night commentary to policy podcasts, one question echoed louder than all others. If this is what was happening in plain sight, what else is hiding behind the curtain? And as the viral clip continued to dominate headlines and light up every screen in America, the public reaction quickly gave way to something deeper. Dissection, analysis, judgment not just of the moment, but of the method behind it. By dawn the next morning, the confrontation between Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Linda McMahon had already been replayed, reanalyzed, and reframed by nearly every major political network and media outlet in the country. Yet what emerged from the noise was not confusion, but rare consensus, across party lines, across ideological divides, across industries that usually share nothing but skepticism for one another. From the polished studio floors of CNN to the heated panels of Fox News, Crockett's handling of the hearing was being heralded as nothing short of a surgical display of governance done right. "What we saw wasn't a political ambush," said Fox News analyst Greg Harrow, his tone unusually reflective for a man often quick to dismiss progressives. "It was a lesson in what preparation looks like. No theatrics, no stunts, just unshakable facts delivered with the composure of someone who came not to posture, but to hold power accountable." Other voices joined in rapidly. Former Senator Claire McCaskill, speaking on MSNBC's Morning Joe, called Crockett's performance a prosecutorial masterpiece. "This wasn't just about exposing Linda McMahon," McCaskill said. "It was about tearing the curtain off an entire system of influence, favoritism, and quiet sabotage that hurts the very people federal aid is supposed to protect." Political strategist Ana Navarro posted a clip from the hearing alongside a single sentence. "Now that's how you cross-examine the system itself." And beyond the media class, something else was shifting, something heavier. By midday, statements began rolling in from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, a moderate Democrat from Virginia, released a public endorsement of the Small Business Equity Act, calling it a critical correction to a federal apparatus that has drifted too far from the communities it was designed to serve. Even more surprising was a measured but clear signal of support from Republican Senator Todd Young, who told reporters outside the Capitol, "Transparency and multi-layered review aren't partisan ideas. They're constitutional safeguards." What we saw in that hearing was not just a problem, it was a pattern, and patterns demand reform. The resonance wasn't limited to Capitol Hill. Across the business world, major voices from small business coalitions and economic equity foundations began echoing the same sentiment. Crockett's revelations didn't just target one administrator, they exposed a systemic rot. Renee Bautista, CEO of the Coalition for Equitable Capital Access, went live on LinkedIn within hours of the hearing and addressed her network of 200,000 small business owners and investors. "This isn't just about politics," she said. "This is about the very reason your funding applications were denied. This is about why your pitch decks got no response. Because people like you, without political connections, without expensive lobbyists, were never meant to be on the shortlist." That's what Representative Crockett put on the record today. And that's why this bill matters. In Detroit, Cleveland, El Paso, and Oakland, chambers of commerce that had previously remained apolitical posted formal letters in support of the bill's key provisions. specifically the requirement for independent, multi-person grant review panels and transparent, real-time reporting of who receives federal funds and why. The message was clear. Accountability was no longer optional. A storm had passed through Washington, and it had cleared the air. But the response wasn't just reactive. It was personal. Dozens of small business owners, many of them from underserved communities, flooded Crockett's office email with testimonies. Some were emotional, others enraged. One email, later read aloud on CNN Tonight, came from a bakery owner in Tulsa who had applied for SBA funding 3 times and been denied each time. "I did everything right," it read. "I went to every workshop. I filled out every form. I took a loan against my own home to qualify. And still, I got nothing. But today I saw someone say out loud what we've all known in silence, that the game is rigged, that we weren't just unlucky, we were unseen. Thank you for dragging this into the light." Crockett's office, overwhelmed but resolute, released a short statement that evening. "This isn't the end. This is the beginning of accountability. We will not stop until equity is no longer a loophole, but the law." Even on Wall Street, where federal grants are often treated as a distant whisper, market analysts took note. Bloomberg News ran a feature under the headline, "Small Business Reform from Committee Room to Boardroom." In it, several venture capitalists acknowledged that public trust in federal grant processes had been deteriorating for years, but that the clarity, structure, and enforceable equity requirements outlined in Crockett's bill might finally bring a new level of legitimacy. "We've watched Black and brown entrepreneurs pitch the same ideas, stronger sometimes, and walk away empty-handed," said Maurice Lattimore, managing partner at Apex Equity Group. "If this legislation passes, that playing field starts to level. That's not just good policy, that's good economics." But perhaps the most dramatic sign that Crockett's performance had broken through the noise came not from political figures or business leaders, but from ordinary Americans. TikTok videos with voiceovers of Crockett's calm but relentless questioning exploded in popularity, some garnering millions of views in under 24 hours. One post, set to a slow-motion replay of Crockett reading McMahon's email, "We need some fast wins with this group," ended with a simple caption, "You just watched corruption get cross-examined live." It was raw, it was unapologetic, and it was exactly the kind of viral justice many felt had been missing for far too long. Even political cynics took notice. Columnist Andrew Callahan, known for his biting skepticism of congressional performance, wrote in Rolling Stone, "Jasmine Crockett just did something that rarely happens in Washington. She changed the conversation, not with slogans, with documents, with receipts, with restraint, and with fury that never once lost its dignity." At a time when hearings are often dismissed as hollow theater, where cameras roll but accountability rarely follows, this was different. There was weight in Crockett's pauses, precision in her tone, and when she pivoted from confrontation to solution, it wasn't to save face, it was to finish the job. Because while Linda McMahon's silence in that room had been deafening, it was Jasmine Crockett's clarity that echoed, not just through the halls of the Capitol, but through every place where truth had been waiting for someone to finally call it by name. And as the public pressure swelled and the air around the Capitol seemed to thrum with the weight of consequence, Jasmine Crockett moved swiftly, not to celebrate, but to legislate. Her next step came not with spectacle, but with strategy, the formal introduction of the Small Business Equity Act into the halls of Congress. It was a move timed with surgical precision, born not out of vengeance, but necessity. And this time, she wasn't walking into a hearing to confront a figurehead. She was stepping into the legislative arena to dismantle the very scaffolding that allowed corruption to hide in plain sight. The bill was clear, unflinching, and sharp as a blade. It proposed an overhaul of the federal small business grant system from top to bottom, mandatory independent review panels, full transparency in applicant tracking, real-time publication of fund recipients, and a strict ban on political affiliation or contribution history being considered in funding decisions. No backroom phone calls, no whispered promises, no more special lanes for the connected. Crockett's language was as plain as it was powerful. Access to opportunity should not be reserved for those who know someone in the room. It should be the right of those who've built something from nothing. And the shock came not from the Democratic side. It came from the silence that followed on the Republican benches. Silence. And then something else. Murmurs of agreement. Within 48 hours, the Small Business Equity Act was co-sponsored by a bipartisan coalition that caught even seasoned analysts off guard. Republican Representative John Curtis of Utah issued a public statement that read, "This is not a partisan matter. This is a procedural failure that affects the backbone of our economy, honest entrepreneurs. The bill's emphasis on fairness and transparency is something all Americans can support." And he wasn't alone. Moderate Republicans in swing districts, sensing the overwhelming public approval and media momentum, added their names to the legislation, some out of conviction, others out of political survival. But the effect was the same. The bill gained muscle. In a stunning display of rare unity, the House Committee on Small Business scheduled an emergency session to prioritize the bill's markup. What followed was not debate, it was acceleration. From committee rooms to press briefings, Crockett's name echoed like a warning bell to lobbyists and old guard operatives who had long profited from invisible loopholes and inaccessible power. This wasn't just policy anymore. It was momentum. And the people who had laughed off the hearing as another piece of political theater were suddenly reading every line of the bill with furrowed brows. Meanwhile, outside the marble walls of Washington, the real shift was happening on the streets, in storefronts, in co-working spaces, in warehouses and cafes, in the corners of the country that power forgets. The National Coalition of Independent Entrepreneurs, a once-splintered alliance of over 3,000 small business associations, issued its first unanimous resolution in years, full and immediate endorsement of the Small Business Equity Act. Their statement didn't mince words. For too long, the system has spoken with a whisper to the privileged and a wall of silence to the rest of us. We stand with Representative Crockett not because she spoke truth, but because she gave it teeth. In Los Angeles, a Latina-owned manufacturing startup called VegaCore posted a viral video explaining how they had been denied funding for 3 years, only to discover that a nearby company with fewer employees and weaker revenue metrics had received priority placement, later traced to a political donor. "We followed every rule," the CEO said through tears, "but they had one thing we didn't, a name on a check. This bill, this is for people like us." And in North Carolina, the Southern Black Founders Alliance held a town hall streamed by nearly 200,000 viewers. Speaker after speaker, from bootstrapped barbershop owners to first-generation tech founders, shared the same story in different words. The door had always been cracked open for a select few. Now Crockett was kicking it off its hinges. "This isn't about handouts," one woman shouted to applause. "This is about taking the thumb off the scale." Even organizations typically wary of federal oversight, like the Liberty Chamber of Independent Business, stunned their base by releasing a cautiously supportive brief. "While we remain concerned about government overreach, we believe this legislation increases accountability while preserving entrepreneurial freedom. It is targeted, enforceable, and overdue." The change in tone across the business community was impossible to ignore. Journalists covering the Capitol began to note that Crockett was no longer being referred to simply as a rising star, but as a force of correction. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline that stunned longtime readers: "Crockett's bill sparks realignment in small business politics." Even former skeptics like columnist Neil Patterson wrote, "I was prepared to dismiss her as another firebrand with a microphone. But then I read the bill. It's not fire, it's a blueprint." Inside Congress, the pressure mounted. Lobbying firms scrambled to find ways to either support or quietly neutralize the bill. But Crockett had already anticipated the maneuvering. She had built the language tightly, with clauses designed to make exemptions nearly impossible without public record and multi-agency review. Every line had been forged in the same fire that exposed Linda McMahon: precision, persistence, and principle. As the legislative calendar moved toward the floor vote, a rare sight emerged in the Capitol. Citizens lining the marble hallways not to protest, but to support. Small business owners flew in from across the country, some sleeping on airport benches to afford the trip, just to show that the bill mattered. They brought placards not with slogans, but stories, loan rejection letters, grant application summaries, tax filings, evidence of what they had built and what had been denied them. Crockett, never one for grandstanding, stood quietly among them in the hallway outside the chamber, thanking each person by name. She didn't speak to the cameras that day. She didn't need to. Her work was already echoing across the country like a thunderclap. Because this time, justice wasn't just being spoken, it was being written into law. And while the momentum of the legislation surged forward, sweeping across Capitol Hill with a righteous fury, Linda McMahon's world was shrinking, fast and mercilessly. The same media networks that once praised her as a visionary entrepreneur now dissected every line of her testimony with surgical cruelty. Her once prized image, the iron-willed businesswoman who had conquered both the private sector and public office, had become an emblem of elitism, favoritism, and institutional rot. In less than 72 hours, her name had fallen from invitations, been stripped from marketing decks, and quietly erased from speaker rosters she once dominated. The decline wasn't loud, it was surgical. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls returned with clipped, rehearsed rejections. Her scheduled keynote at the Conservative Women's Leadership Forum was postponed indefinitely, a polite euphemism no one believed. Behind closed doors, those who had once touted her as a model of American enterprise were now whispering about reputational risk. One think tank director was overheard telling staff, "We can't have her associated with us while that video is still circulating. We'd be inviting a riot into the comment section." In her Connecticut estate, the silence was deafening. No camera crews, no calls from cable producers, just the muted tap of PR consultants advising her to go quiet for now. She declined all interviews, all rebuttals, all attempted salvaging, not because she was cornered, but because somewhere beneath the layers of curated authority, she had begun to understand. This wasn't a political loss. This was a legacy in freefall. The institutions she helped shape, the business groups, the conservative foundations, the executive boards, began to drift away like ships pulling anchor. Board members from one economic policy council she co-founded held an emergency vote. She was quietly asked to resign. No formal press release, no thanks for her service. Just a line in a Monday memo, board composition updated, effective immediately. And then came the withdrawal, not just by organizations, but by people. Former allies, co-hosts, donors, strategists. Even those who had once benefited from her political patronage now avoided eye contact at luncheons and retreats. At a closed-door donor gala in Palm Beach, she entered a room and the conversation thinned to near nothing. A few nodded stiffly. No one invited her to sit. The chill was undeniable, and the commentary didn't stop at politics. Journalists began digging into the internal practices of her tenure at the Small Business Administration with renewed vigor. Articles from left, center, and right began connecting dots between previously ignored anomalies, funding anomalies, contract accelerations, advisory hires. The Crockett hearing was a match dropped on a powder trail, wrote one investigative columnist in The Atlantic, and McMahon lit that trail herself years ago with every unchecked exception and privilege pass. The op-eds were relentless. "The end of the McMahon myth," one declared. "From wrestling rings to public shame," said another. Even her defenders couldn't find footing. One loyal commentator on a business news channel tried to pivot, suggesting the backlash was just another chapter in cancel culture. The clip flopped. Twitter called it the worst spin since Enron. And then came the shift from critique to consequence. Two small business owners, both denied grants during her tenure, filed a joint lawsuit citing arbitrary and biased practices that violated federal guidelines. Their evidence? Internal memos surfaced through FOIA requests that revealed irregular review patterns eerily similar to what Crockett had exposed. The plaintiffs didn't just want compensation, they wanted structural change. The suit's impact was immediate. Public sympathy swelled around the entrepreneurs. National legal networks offered pro bono counsel. And McMahon, though not formally charged, was suddenly the face of a class action movement she could no longer control. But perhaps the most crushing blow came from a source no one expected: Vince McMahon himself. In a statement released through World Wrestling Entertainment's legal team, the company declared that Linda McMahon's past governmental decisions do not reflect the values or business practices of WWE. A clean-cut, public, brutal. For decades, the McMahon name had been synonymous with dominance, inside the ring and out. But now even her family's empire was stepping back, walling off her liability like a quarantine contagion. And still, she said nothing. No press conference, no apology tour, no ghost-written op-ed. Only once at a quiet charity fundraiser weeks later did she speak briefly. "I thought I was helping," she told a small circle of attendees. Her voice cracked on the last word. "But maybe I was only helping the people who already had everything." The room fell silent. No applause followed. Some called it too little, too late. Others said it was the first honest thing she had uttered in years. But no matter how you parsed it, the era of Linda McMahon was over. She withdrew from public boards. She turned down offers to appear on business panels. Her social media presence, once curated by a small team of strategists and image makers, went dark. The last post, dated just days before the hearing, was a smiling photo with the caption, "Proud to support small business across this great nation." No comments remained. Her inner circle, now whittled to a handful of loyalists, tried to shield her. But the damage wasn't reputational alone. It was personal. In the months that followed, she began spending most of her time outside Washington. No more fundraisers, no more panels, no more headlines. Just silence. And the humbling realization that influence, once broken, rarely mends the same way. The woman who once stood at the pinnacle of American entrepreneurship, a titan who parlayed wrestling empire success into the corridors of national power, had been undone, not by scandal alone, but by exposure, by the cold light of truth, wielded without rage, without spectacle, but with precision. And in the end, that was the irony that stung the most. She hadn't been taken down by smear campaigns or partisan war. She had been taken down by facts. And yet, from the wreckage of exposed corruption and reputational collapse, something unexpected began to rise. Not shame, not vengeance, but reform. While Linda McMahon receded from the public eye and the political world recalibrated in the aftermath, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had not paused. She did not celebrate. She did not grandstand. She returned to her district, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. For her, the hearing was never about spectacle. It was about justice. And justice, she believed, must be proven not in headlines, but in the lives of people who had been denied a seat at the table for far too long. 1 year to the day after that unforgettable hearing, the effects of the Small Business Equity Act had rippled outward like a tide, finally reaching the shores it was meant for. The numbers didn't just tell a story, they told a revolution. In her district alone, over $15 million in federal small business funding had been allocated directly to underserved neighborhoods. That figure wasn't just impressive, it was seismic. The previous year, that same district had received just under $3 million. Now, thanks to the oversight mandates, equity scoring systems, and independent grant review panels mandated by Crockett's legislation, the money was flowing where it had always been promised, but never truly arrived. Into the hands of those who built their dreams, one brick, $1, one sleepless night at a time. It wasn't just numbers. It was faces, stories, lives. In South Dallas, a Black-owned tech startup that had been denied 3 years in a row due to insufficient scalability now had a fully staffed office and had just hired its 12th employee. The founder, a former teacher named Calvin Miles, had tears in his eyes when he told a local reporter, "They used to tell us, you don't qualify. Now, we're building apps that help kids learn math in the very schools that forgot about us. That's because of her. That's because of Jasmine Crockett." In Oak Cliff, a Latina mother of 3 named Maria Delgado had opened a community bakery, Pani Alma, Bread and Soul, using a grant she never thought she'd see. "They used to say, 'You're not what we're looking for,'" she said during a televised town hall. "Now my daughter helps me run the register after school. My son bakes with me in the mornings. I'm not just a small business. I'm the center of something, a change." Across the state, from Houston's Fifth Ward to El Paso's border communities, entrepreneurs who had long been invisible to federal programs were now being heard, funded, and supported. And it was not an accident. It was policy. It was architecture. It was the result of Crockett walking into the lion's den, confronting a titan of privilege and exposure, and rewriting the rules with the same fire she had once used to survive. But what made this transformation even more powerful was its moral symmetry. Where McMahon had once funneled taxpayer dollars toward political allies and legacy corporations, Crockett's reform bill had removed the dark corridors of influence. Under the new mandates, grant recipients were anonymized during the first round of reviews. Applications were scored on community impact, fiscal transparency, and innovation, not donor history or insider relationships. Reviewers, now bound by rotating blind panels, had no knowledge of race, political alignment, or background wealth. The system was no longer tilted, it was reset. And the results? They were immediate. More than 400 minority-owned businesses across the United States had received their first ever federal support. A historic number of applications had come from rural indigenous communities. In Alabama, a women-led construction cooperative on tribal land was finally able to launch a training program for young apprentices. In Detroit, a group of formerly incarcerated men opened a mechanic school that combined hands-on learning with literacy and reintegration services. The ripple effects were beyond economic. They were generational. And the people noticed. Media outlets that had once covered the hearing as political theater were now forced to return, this time to report on its consequences. The Crockett reform, 1 year later, became a primetime special on PBS. CNN aired a feature titled From Shadow to Spotlight, How One Bill Changed the Face of Small Business in America. Even skeptics from the business world began to acknowledge what they could no longer deny. The old system hadn't just failed, it had excluded. And now finally the floodgates had opened. Crockett didn't bask in this. In fact, she barely acknowledged the attention. Her focus remained fixed on implementation, oversight, and future phases of the reform. When she returned to Washington for a press briefing marking the 1 year anniversary, she walked to the podium in the exact same blazer she wore at the McMahon hearing. It was intentional, and her words were clear. "This is not about revenge," she said, her voice firm but measured. "This is about restoration. This is about the father who got a second chance after a felony, the immigrant family that turned a food cart into a restaurant, the girl who now believes she doesn't have to inherit poverty but can inherit pride. This is the work, and I'm not done." That statement echoed across newsrooms and community halls alike. But perhaps the most powerful recognition didn't come from headlines or government websites. It came from within the communities themselves. In the heart of West Dallas, a mural had been painted across the side of a formerly abandoned building, now home to 6 new Black-owned businesses. The image showed a young girl standing in front of a courtroom, holding a folder above her head. On the folder, a dollar sign wrapped in justice scales, and above her, spray-painted in white letters, "The Power of One Voice." And just beneath it, in smaller gold print, someone had signed a name, Crockett. The mural wasn't commissioned. It wasn't sponsored by a PAC or campaign committee. It was painted by local youth artists using donated supplies, because to them, this wasn't politics. This was prophecy fulfilled. The power of that moment, the knowledge that change had not only arrived but had rooted itself in the ground where nothing had grown before, was the final word Jasmine Crockett never had to speak. And yet, the work ahead was still massive. She knew this. Every gain could be threatened. Every reform could be undone with the stroke of a pen in a future administration. So she doubled down, establishing district oversight teams, pushing for digital transparency portals, and even proposing a grant literacy initiative in public schools to teach young students how federal funding worked. Access should not require a lawyer and a miracle, she told the House Education Committee. It should be built into the language of public service. In private, her team would often remark on her relentlessness. "You already won," one aide said to her. "You changed the law. The legacy's secure." But she shook her head. "Justice doesn't live in laws," she said. "It lives in what happens after." And so, while headlines moved on to the next scandal, While the world forgot the courtroom tears of Linda McMahon and the viral firestorm that had once consumed the internet, Crockett continued in the trenches, fighting for another business, another block, another child with a dream. Because for her, this wasn't the end of a political battle. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous: hope. As Crockett stood firm beneath the weight of national scrutiny, it became clear that what had unfolded wasn't just a political clash. It was a masterclass in how truth, when wielded with discipline, could cut deeper than any slogan ever could. In the weeks that followed, the Crockett-McMahon confrontation was no longer treated as a typical congressional hearing. It was dissected like a landmark ruling, a strategic playbook, a reckoning wrapped in resolve. News anchors dropped their usual cynicism and spoke with a rare tone of admiration. Political commentators, both left and right, conceded that what Jasmine Crockett had delivered wasn't theater, but a devastatingly effective demonstration of how facts, timing, and moral clarity could outperform the loudest political charades. The hearing became required viewing in legislative workshops and university courses. One viral clip alone, Crockett calmly flipping open a folder while McMahon visibly withered, was shared over 18 million times, often captioned, "This is how you hold power accountable." The impact went beyond headlines. Inside the halls of Congress, young staffers began to whisper phrases like, "pulling a Crockett when strategizing for oversight briefings." Seasoned lawmakers, hardened by years of procedural gridlock, quietly recalibrated their expectations of what one well-prepared voice could accomplish. In town halls across the country, constituents started demanding fewer sound bites and more spreadsheets. What Jasmine Crockett had proven, what she had embodied, was that diligence could still triumph over deception, that real reform didn't need to shout if it could show. Behind closed doors, even those who had dismissed her as a rising firebrand now revised their opinions. "She didn't just come to make noise," one senior senator remarked privately. "She came to restore the floor to what it was meant to be, a place for truth to be heard, not buried under applause lines." And perhaps the most telling shift wasn't in political rhetoric, but in the redefinition of leadership itself. For once, the public wasn't captivated by drama, but by demonstration. Watching someone walk into a hearing armed not with bravado, but with bulletproof evidence and the quiet courage to wield it under pressure. Even Crockett's critics struggled to find fault. Her composure was unshakable. Her arguments were footnoted. Her motives, protecting small, underserved businesses, were impossible to paint as partisan. The unfairness she had faced leading up to the hearing, doubts about her credibility, dismissals of her district's needs, subtle digs about her political style, were now exposed for what they were: noise. And she had risen above it, not by playing the game, but by rewriting the rules. In a political climate drowning in empty catchphrases and weaponized drama, Crockett's approach landed like a thunderclap. She didn't torch the system, she out-reasoned it. And in doing so, she reminded the nation of something it had nearly forgotten: that the most powerful tool in democracy isn't rage, it's readiness. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.